To use SQL or to interact with SQL from inside Node, we need to install a new package. And we do that with npm install, of course. Npm install, and let me simply bring that up to make it easier to read. Npm install -- save, because it will be a production dependency, one which is a crucial part of our application. And the name is MySQL 2. This is simply a later version of, well, MySQL 1, as you might guess, and it allows us to write SQL code and version of well, MySQL 1, as you might guess, and it allows us to write SQL code and execute SQL code in Node and interact with a database. Now, with that installed, we made one important step forward towards using MySQL. The next step is that we need to connect to our database from inside our application. And for that, I will close my views here and go to the util folder we created in the past. There we have that path.js file in there, which we don't really use anymore. But we can also create a new file in here, the database.js file. And the name is totally up to you, by the way. In there, I want to set up the code that will allow us to connect to the SQL database and then also give us back a connection object, so to say, which allows us to run queries. For this, I'll first of all import that MySQL package and store it in a MySQL constant. So require MySQL 2 is the command I need here. And now there are two ways of connecting with a SQL database. One is that we set up one connection, which we can then use to run queries. And we should always close the connection once we're done with a query. And the downside is that we need to re-execute the code to create the connection for every new query. And there will be a lot of queries because we fetch data, we write data, we delete data. Creating new connections all the time quickly becomes very inefficient, both in our code and also regarding the connection to the database, which is established, and the performance this may cost. So a better way is to create a so-called connection pool. And by the way, you can learn way more about this package, its options regarding how to set up connections and so on in the official docs for this tool or for this package. And you find a link to those docs in the last lecture of this module. So to set up such a pool, I'll create a new constant pool. The name is up to you. And I'll use that MySQL object, and there I will call create pool. And there you also see that create connection we could use. Now, I don't want a single connection, but a pool of connections, which will allow us to always reach out to it whenever we have a query to run. And then we get a new connection from that pool, which manages multiple connections so that we can run multiple queries simultaneously because each query needs its own connection. And once the query is done, the connection will be handed back into the pool and it's available again for a new query. And the pool can then be finished when our application shuts down. So I will call create pool here, and I need to pass in a JavaScript object with some information about our database engine, our database host we're connecting to. For that, I'll first of all define the host, so the server IP address or name. And that is localhost because it's running on our local machine here. Then I need to define the username, and that by default is root. That was given to us during the configuration process. I also need to define the exact database name because this gives us access to a database. a database server, but that server typically has multiple databases. And here, our databases are our schemas. So we'll take the node complete database here. So that the value here simply is node complete. Now with that, we simply have to enter one more piece of information, and that is of course our password. So here, enter password, and then I used this password. You should of course use the password you assigned during installation. This will create a pool, and now I can export this pool, and it will export it in a special way. Actually, I will call promise here, because this will allow us to use promises when working with these connections, which of course handle asynchronous tasks, asynchronous data, instead of callbacks, because promises allow us to write code in a bit more structured way. We don't have many nested callbacks. Instead, we can use promise chains, and you will see what I mean in this module, of course. So now we can always import from the database.js file to get access to that pool and to the connections in there. And I can show this as an example by simply going to app.js, which will of course run when our application starts up. And there, let's simply import database, maybe store it in a constant named db, by requiring util database like this. So reach run when our application starts up. This JS file to get access to that pool and to the connections in there. And I can show this as an example by simply going to app.js, which will of course run when our application starts up. And there, let's simply import database, maybe store it in a constant named db, by requiring util database like this. So reaching out to that new database file we just created. This will then be the pool basically, or well, the pool which allows us to use a connection in it. And if I now use this, let's say here, I can run db, and now we got a couple of methods. One of them is execute, which allows us to execute queries. We also got query, but execute is a bit safer, so we'll use that. We can also end it, and we want to end it whenever our application is to shut down, but we don't shut our application down in this case here, so no need to call end here. Instead, we just want to connect or execute a command. And we can execute a command here by writing SQL syntax as a string. Now, of course, that means you need to know SQL, and I will teach you a very basic SQL here in this course. If you plan on using MySQL together with your Node app, you definitely also have to take a SQL course, which dives into all the depths of the SQL language. because that is far beyond the scope of this course, which is of course a Node course and not a SQL course. But what we could do here is we could select everything from products, and of course we have no products table yet. So let's quickly go back to our workbench, and here on tables, right click and click create table. And this gives you now the table editor. The name should now be products, and in there you can add new fields. Remember that schema thing? You add fields. So let's work on this and finish this and execute our first little code in the next lecture. So let's finish that setup of the products table, which I need for my first little demo code. Here in the table editor, so to say, in the workbench, we can define how a product's entry should look like. For that, we first of all define the name of a field, ID, and the data type. And for the ID, an integer is fine. We can also check that it should be the primary key by which records in this table will be identified, that it must not be null, that it should be unique, that should definitely be the case, if it should hold binary data, which is not the case, if it's unsigned, so if it holds no negative values, which should also be the case because that should be an integer starting at 1 and then incrementing. Here, if it is zero fill, and for us important, if it's auto-incrementing, and that should be the case because every new record should receive that automatically and it should be a higher number than in the last record. Now, a product also typically has a title, and there I'll use a varchar, which is basically a string. I'll just define that it may be up to 255 characters long, and longer titles will simply be cut off. So that is something to keep in mind. It must also not be null, so we have to have a value in there, but I don't need any other setting here. For a product, I also want to have a price, and here I want to have a double, so that we can enter decimal places. This must also not be null. I also want to have a description, which now will not be a varchar, but will be text. And if you're wondering which data types are available, that is exactly what I meant. You should definitely consult a full SQL course to learn more about the available data types and how to work with them. So here I got my text, which is simply a longer text than the varchar, which has a limitation. And I will have an image URL, which I'll also set to varchar 255, which means longer URLs also won't work. With that, I defined how my product should look like. You can leave everything else as it is, and then on the bottom right again, click on Apply here. Everything else as it is, and then on the bottom right again, click on Apply here. It shows you the SQL statement it will execute, and you could execute this on your own, for example in Node, of course, to always create this new table. Here, we'll do it in the workbench, so click Apply, Close, and now on tables, you see that, for example, in Node, of course, to all everything else as it is. And then on the bottom right again, click on Apply here. It shows you the SQL statement it will execute, and you could execute this on your own, for example in Node, of course, to always create this new table. Here, we'll do it in the workbench, so click Apply, Close, and now on tables, you see the new products table. And if you click this icon here, on the very right, you can see the entries in there. By the way, you also see the SQL query that was executed to look into that. And that is pretty similar. You can see, and if you click this icon here, on the very right, you can see the entries in there. By the way, you also see the SQL query that was executed to look into that. And that is pretty similar to the query we're executing here. So now that the table is set up, we just need to enter one dummy data so that we have something to fetch. And I will simply add a book here, with a price of, let's say, $12.99. Description: this is an awesome book. And also an image URL. URL. Now, if you got problems, copying a value in here, you simply have to type it manually. Copying also didn't work for me. Of course, you can also enter some dummy value and just live with no image being displayed. Now let's also enter an ID here, though that should be auto-generated if you don't do it. Click on apply in the bottom right, apply here, close, and now if you again click on this icon here, next to products there in the left column, you see that now this one element was added here. Now that we got a book in here, let's go back to our node code, and there we can now change then. And now this is something provided by the fact that we're using promise here when exporting the pool. We now get back promises when executing queries, like this with execute. And promises have two functions, then and catch. Let's explore them in the next lecture. So we're executing a query here with execute on our pool, on the products table we just created, and I added then and catch. These are functions we can chain onto the result of the execute call, so they will execute on whatever this gives us back, and this whatever is our so-called promise. Now, a promise is a basic JavaScript object, not specific to Node. It's also available in JavaScript in the browser, which allows us to work with asynchronous code. Instead of using callbacks, which we could also use with the MySQL package, promises allow us to write more structured code. Because instead of having a nested anonymous function here as a second argument, we simply have a then block, which will then get the anonymous function to execute. Now, the advantage is we can also write it like this, and now we have very readable code instead of having a nested code here. And that nested code especially becomes a problem if we have more and more asynchronous tasks depending on each other. Now, we also don't just have then, we also have catch, and this also has a function which executes in case of an error. So, for example, if the database connection fails or something like this. We get the error object here, and this is just a modern JavaScript syntax where we get one argument and then we handle it here. And I can simply log it with the console so that we at least see what the error was. Now we hopefully end up here, and we probably get an argument here too. Let's name it result for now, and let's also log result here then. And now let's see what we get. If I run npm start to bring up that server again, this immediately immediately executes because it's part of the app.js file. And if we have a look at it with the console, so the browser, which allows us to work with asynchronous code. Instead of using callbacks, executing here. That it should be, we can all define the name of a field.